The date is April 7, 1944. A Sherman M4 tank rumbles across the muddy fields near Caen, Normandy. Its suspension groans under the weight of armor and crew. The 75mm gun mounted in its turret trained forward, scanning the horizon for enemy movement. Inside, the driver struggles with controls that are cramped, the transmission noisy and unrefined, the engine producing a constant vibration that penetrates every bone in the body. Across the same fields, a Churchill Mk4 tank is advancing, its massive tracks crushing earth, turret rotating slowly but with deliberate precision. Its 6-pounder gun sits low and steady, the armor thick and sloped to deflect incoming fire. The contrast between these two machines is immediate and measurable. This is not propaganda or national rivalry. It is the result of fundamentally different design philosophies. American and British tank engineers approached armored warfare with entirely separate operational assumptions. The Sherman was a product of mass production doctrine. By 1942, American engineers, working under the constraints of industrial capacity and strategic doctrine, prioritized mobility, ease of maintenance, and interchangeability of parts. The 75mm M3 gun was versatile, adequate against most German medium tanks, and could fire high explosive rounds effectively against infantry and fortifications. The chassis was designed for speed and reliability, but armor thickness was limited, approximately 50mm on the frontal hull in early variants, sloped only minimally. The assumption was that speed, numbers, and coordinated infantry support would offset vulnerabilities. Sherman crews were trained to rely on numbers and tactical maneuver rather than the tank's innate survivability in a direct engagement with German heavy armor. The Churchill, in contrast, was conceived for entirely different conditions. Britain's experience in North Africa and the early Western Desert campaigns had demonstrated that tanks were often required to assault prepared defensive positions and cross fortified terrain. Engineers prioritized heavy armor over mobility. By 1944, Churchill Mk4 variants carried armor of up to 102mm on the frontal plate, sloped to maximize deflection, with sides and turrets similarly reinforced. The gun, while smaller in caliber in early marks, was accurate, reliable, and integrated with armor-piercing ammunition designed to punch through fortifications and German medium armor. The suspension was slower, less agile, but capable of crossing shell-pocked fields and trenches with minimal risk of immobilization. Where the Sherman could be outmaneuvered or disabled by a single hit to a weak point, the Churchill could endure multiple strikes and continue advancing. Weight distribution and crew survivability further illustrate the differences. The Sherman's design emphasized a lighter hull and turret to allow for faster production and easier transport. Its gasoline engine, while providing decent speed, was prone to catastrophic fires when penetrated, the infamous Ronson reputation. Sherman crews faced significantly higher risks if the tank was hit from the front or side by German 75mm or 88mm rounds. British doctrine, reflected in the Churchill's design, accepted reduced speed to provide thicker armor, redundancy in internal systems, and fuel placement that minimized catastrophic fires. Crews in a Churchill were far more likely to survive hits that would have destroyed a Sherman instantly. The disparity extended to battlefield roles. Shermans were expected to operate in combined arms formations, exploiting breakthroughs and providing rapid-fire support to infantry. Churchills, on contrast, were often assigned to assault entrenched positions, bunkers, or urban fortifications where slower speed and heavier armor were advantages. Their turrets allowed for low-profile firing angles suitable for attacking buildings or pillboxes. Engineering modifications were common. Some were equipped with flame projectors, bridge-laying gear, or mine-clearing equipment. This versatility made them invaluable in situations where raw numbers alone could not achieve tactical objectives. Firepower comparisons highlight additional distinctions. The standard Sherman 75mm gun could penetrate armor up to 65mm at 500 meters using standard APC rounds. Against heavier German tanks, such as the Panther or Tiger, this proved largely insufficient, unless flanking shots could be achieved. The Churchill Mk4's 6-pounder gun fired ammunition with higher muzzle velocity and better armor-piercing capability against medium German tanks. Later variants, such as the Churchill Mk7 with the 75mm gun, combined this penetrating power with significantly improved armor, creating a vehicle that could trade shots with German tanks and survive the engagement. The Sherman, reliant on maneuver and numbers, often faced fatal engagements if isolated. Reliability under combat stress also diverged. Shermans were mechanically simpler, easier to repair in field workshops, and could be produced rapidly, a critical factor in the American approach to armored warfare. Churchills were more complex, heavier, and slower to repair, but they could operate under conditions that would immobilize Shermans. Mud, trenches, rubble, all these were manageable for Churchills due to wider tracks, robust suspension, and over-engineered drivetrain components. In Normandy, when terrain included hedgerows, bombed-out villages, and flooded fields, the Churchills outlasted Sherman units that became bogged down or disabled. Logistics influenced operational deployment. American forces could afford to lose a Sherman and replace it quickly. Production lines were capable of producing thousands per month. British forces, constrained by smaller industrial output and shipping limitations, emphasized survivability and mission completion over replacement. Every Churchill that survived the engagement was a tactical asset. Every Sherman could be replaced, making attrition acceptable in the American model, but a cost to be minimized in the British model. In urban and fortified operations, the differences became stark. Sherman units attacking fortified positions without direct infantry support faced high casualty rates. Their armor could be penetrated by German anti-tank weapons at moderate ranges, and mobility could be hindered by rubble or narrow streets. Churchills, slow but heavily armored, could approach fortifications, sustain hits, and deliver firepower against targets impervious to Sherman shells.
British doctrine integrated this design with tactics that exploited armor thickness over mobility, accepting the slower advance for guaranteed impact. By April 1944, operational reports from Normandy indicated that Sherman units could overwhelm light defenses through speed, maneuver, and massed fire, but struggled against entrenched positions and German heavy tanks. Churchill units, while less numerous, consistently achieved objectives that Shermans could not, neutralizing pillboxes, advancing through urban centers, and surviving anti-tank ambushes. The difference was not merely mechanical, it was doctrinal. Sherman's success depended on rapid engagement, flanking, and numerical superiority. Churchill's success relied on endurance, armor resilience, and methodical firepower. Ultimately, the distinction between the Sherman and Churchill illustrates two entirely separate philosophies of armored warfare. American engineers and strategists prioritized mobility, mass production, and tactical flexibility. Vehicles could be replaced if lost, so speed and quantity dominated the design equation. British engineers prioritized survivability, penetration, and mission completion. Speed and production efficiency were secondary to ensuring that a tank could survive combat and deliver its ordnance effectively. This difference shaped the experience of armored warfare in Western Europe in 1944-45 and explains why, in head-to-head comparisons against heavily fortified positions or German heavy armor, the Sherman often fell short where the Churchill excelled. The fighting in Normandy provides a vivid case study of how these philosophical differences translated into battlefield outcomes. Take, for example, the operations surrounding the town of Caen in June and July 1944. Sherman units were deployed in large numbers, advancing along open fields and lightly defended roads, intended to punch through German lines and exploit gaps in the defensive network. On paper, numerical superiority and mobility should have provided clear advantages. In practice, the terrain, hedgerows, and German defensive positions neutralized much of that mobility. Sherman tanks often became exposed as they attempted to flank German positions. One direct hit from a Panther 75mm high-velocity gun could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor at ranges beyond 500 meters. Even a side shot from an 88mm anti-tank gun frequently resulted in catastrophic loss. Casualty reports from late June show that entire platoons of Shermans could be disabled within a single day of combat, sometimes before infantry could consolidate the ground they were meant to hold. Churchill units, operating on the same fields, performed differently. Their heavier frontal armor allowed them to advance under direct fire from anti-tank positions, sometimes surviving multiple hits without being knocked out. In the fighting around Tilly-sur-Seulles, British reports noted Churchill sustaining hits from 75mm and even captured German 88mm guns and continuing to operate. While slow, they could methodically approach fortified positions, engage pillboxes, and neutralize strongpoints without immediate infantry support. The wider tracks and robust suspension system reduced the chance of immobilization in soft ground or shell-cratered fields. The Churchill's low-profile turret also meant that German gunners had a smaller target to aim for, further increasing survivability. Differences in gun effectiveness also played a decisive role in these engagements. Shermans with the 75mm gun could penetrate the side armor of early-model Panzer IVs at typical combat ranges, but struggled against Panthers or Tigers unless targeting weak spots. The British 6-pounder, while smaller in caliber, fired a high-velocity armor-piercing shell capable of punching through medium German tanks more consistently at the same ranges. When the Churchill Mark VII appeared on the battlefield with a 75mm gun, it combined the armor necessary to survive return fire with sufficient penetration to threaten even heavier German vehicles. This meant that Churchills could engage fortified or heavily armored positions directly, whereas Shermans often required tactical maneuvering to achieve flanking shots, a luxury denied by hedgerows, rubble, or enemy minefields. One particularly illustrative engagement occurred during Operation Bluecoat in late July 1944. Sherman regiments advancing toward Hill 309 encountered a network of German Tiger I and Panther tanks concealed within wooded ridges. Sherman crews attempted to maneuver across open fields to avoid direct confrontation, but the German tanks exploited the terrain, using elevated positions to fire down into vulnerable areas. Within minutes, several Shermans were destroyed or immobilized. Meanwhile, a small force of Churchill Mark IV tanks assigned to support the infantry assault directly on the hill advanced deliberately along a cleared path. German fire impacted repeatedly on their thick frontal armor, causing mechanical damage in a few cases, but leaving the crew largely unharmed. The Churchill 6-pounder guns systematically eliminated German anti-tank emplacements and lighter tanks, enabling the infantry to seize the ridge. Operational reports highlighted that without Churchill support, infantry casualties would have been exponentially higher, and the hill may have remained in German hands longer. The difference wasn't limited to armor or armament. Mechanical reliability under stress was equally significant. Shermans, with their gasoline engines, were prone to fires when hit, something both German soldiers and Allied crews recognized immediately. Reports from Normandy consistently cite the M4 being nicknamed Ronson for its tendency to ignite, first time every time, when penetrated.
Crew survival often depended on rapid evacuation, which was difficult under fire and in broken terrain. Churchills, with their slower diesel or later gasoline variants and better internal layout, were far less flammable. Even after being struck, they often remained operational long enough to withdraw or complete the assigned objective. For tank crews, this difference meant the difference between life and death, and operational continuity versus immediate replacement needs. Urban and fortified operations amplified these distinctions. Shermans often struggled to engage in close-quarter fighting, where narrow streets, rubble, and buildings obstructed maneuver. The Shermans' higher profile and less robust armor made them vulnerable to anti-tank teams hiding in buildings or rubble. Churchills, by contrast, could methodically clear fortified towns, sustain multiple hits from concealed weapons, and advance while keeping their main gun effective. In the assault on Caen, for instance, Churchill squadrons repeatedly led operations into bombed-out districts, their armor allowing them to suppress enemy positions while minimizing crew casualties. Shermans, following the same paths without support, often found themselves neutralized before achieving objectives, requiring reinforcements or alternative routes. Engineering adaptations further demonstrate British emphasis on battlefield versatility. Churchill units were frequently modified with special equipment: flamethrowers, mine flails, bridging gear, or extra armor for assault roles. These modifications were possible because the design already emphasized internal volume and structural resilience over speed. Shermans, in contrast, were less amenable to extensive field modifications. Add-on armor and additional weapons were possible, but often compromised mechanical reliability or mobility. This meant that Churchills could be specialized for unique operations that Shermans simply couldn't perform effectively. Field commanders quickly recognized these differences and adapted deployment accordingly. American doctrine emphasized Shermans in large, concentrated formations to exploit breakthroughs and provide massed firepower over open terrain. British doctrine, exploiting Churchill strengths, placed tanks in close coordination with infantry, artillery, and engineers, using slower, methodical advances to eliminate fortified positions. In mixed operations, Shermans would often move to exploit gains secured by Churchill advances. The two approaches complemented each other, but reflected fundamentally different expectations of what a tank should do and how survivability factored into overall mission planning. Armor penetration statistics underline these operational realities. Against a Panther's frontal glacis, the Sherman's 75mm had virtually no chance of penetration at normal engagement ranges. Even a flanking shot was risky under field conditions. The Churchill Mk4 or 7, with its 6-pounder or 75mm gun, could penetrate Panther side armor more reliably and absorb incoming fire while returning accurate shots. In attritional engagements, this allowed Churchill crews to engage enemy heavy armor without depending entirely on tactical flanking maneuvers. The Sherman's dependence on numbers and maneuver became a tactical limitation against prepared German defenses or elite armored units. In Normandy, hedgerow country exemplified terrain where Churchill-designed advantages were magnified. The high ground, deep ditches, and dense hedgerows constrained Sherman mobility, exposed flanks, and limited fields of fire. Churchills, with wider tracks, low profile, and heavier suspension, could climb embankments, cross trenches, and deliver direct fire without being easily disabled. Battlefield reports from June and July 1944 show that Sherman losses increased dramatically in these conditions, while Churchill squadrons maintained operational effectiveness. Commanders often assigned Churchills to spearhead assaults in hedgerow-dense regions, understanding that their durability compensated for slower advance and lower tactical speed. Fuel logistics also played a role. Shermans, designed for long-range mobility and mass deployment, consumed fuel at higher rates in difficult terrain, sometimes limiting operational endurance during extended engagements. Churchills, while slower, had lower operational fuel demands relative to weight and could remain in position longer, sustaining fire and supporting infantry over extended periods without immediate resupply. In operations where mobility was restricted or resupply lines were uncertain, Churchills provided a persistent armored presence that Shermans could not reliably match. The psychological effect on crews and infantry cannot be overlooked. Infantry soldiers reported that advancing behind Churchills instilled confidence, knowing that the tanks could absorb multiple hits while continuing to engage the enemy. Sherman crews, aware of vulnerability to German heavy guns, often advanced with heightened caution, limiting aggressiveness and delaying attacks. This dynamic shaped tactical behavior across divisions and affected both mission timing and casualty rates. Even in combined operations with artillery and air support, these differences mattered. While Sherman units could be reinforced and replaced if lost, their tactical limitations meant that breakthroughs required careful coordination and sometimes failed if terrain or enemy deployment negated speed advantages.
Churchill units could operate effectively in smaller numbers, absorbing direct hits and maintaining firepower, allowing infantry to clear fortified zones without relying on massed armored formations. In essence, one Churchill could achieve what several Shermans often could not in the same scenario. The operational record from Normandy, Italy, and later in the crossing of the Rhine consistently reinforces the pattern. Shermans excelled in rapid exploitation, open field maneuvers, and massed attacks where enemy resistance was light or scattered. Churchills excelled in assaulting fortified positions, urban combat, and terrain where durability and firepower outweighed mobility. The distinction was not theoretical. It was confirmed in battle after battle, in engagements where every decision, every armor penetration, and every casualty highlighted the consequences of divergent design philosophies. The contrast also influenced subsequent British armor doctrine. Churchill performance validated the idea that armor could be purpose-built for specialized roles, rather than generalist mobility, encouraging experimentation with specialized variants such as AVREs for engineering tasks, flame tanks for bunker clearing, and bridge layers for rapid crossing under fire. American doctrine continued to emphasize mobility and numerical advantage, producing tanks like the Sherman Firefly with modifications to address specific threats, but never fully reconciling the fundamental vulnerability in frontal armor and crew survivability that Churchills had been designed to overcome. By analyzing these engagements, it becomes clear why, despite being technically less advanced in engine power or speed, Churchill armor consistently outperformed Sherman survivability in high-risk combat scenarios. The British design prioritized mission completion and crew endurance, whereas the American approach accepted attrition in exchange for mobility and production volume. The operational consequences were dramatic. Churchills enabled British and Canadian infantry to capture positions and maintain momentum under conditions that would have stalled or destroyed equivalent Sherman units. In this context, armored superiority was not about the size of the gun or the horsepower of the engine alone. It was about the integration of armor, crew safety, and battlefield mission profiles, a combination where the Churchill often had the decisive edge. The story of armored warfare and its stark divergence between Sherman and Churchill tanks did not end in Normandy. As Allied forces pushed through the Seine and advanced toward the Low Countries, the differences between American and British tanks became even more pronounced under new operational pressures. Italy had already offered a testing ground for these contrasts, but the Rhine crossings and the push into Germany exposed the extremes of design philosophy under conditions that combined water obstacles, fortified towns, and increasingly desperate German defenses. In northern France during August 1944, Sherman units were tasked with rapid exploitation along the open plains after the breakout from Normandy. Their speed and reliability over long distances allowed American forces to outflank German units retreating along the Seine and Loire rivers. Convoys of Shermans, often accompanied by mechanized infantry and artillery, surged along secondary roads and through lightly defended towns. The tanks could respond to emerging threats quickly, coordinate with other units, and, if necessary, abandon compromised positions to avoid ambush. In such scenarios, Shermans were perfectly suited. Their lighter weight and engine efficiency made long advances sustainable. Their mechanical simplicity allowed field repairs without elaborate support, and their numbers provided the mass necessary to maintain momentum even after sustaining losses. However, these conditions were not universally favorable. In the riverine and canal-laden regions of the Netherlands, Sherman vulnerabilities became glaringly obvious. Towns like Arnhem, flooded polders, and narrow bridges placed immense strain on tank mobility. Roads were often washed out, canals required bridging, and narrow urban streets left tanks exposed to well-concealed Panzerfaust teams. Shermans, designed for mobility over open ground, struggled to adapt. Units advancing through flooded fields often found themselves trapped in soft soil, engine compartments flooded, tracks caked with mud, and guns unable to achieve stable firing positions. Even small obstructions like hedgerow remnants in rural pockets could immobilize them for hours. Every minute of delay increased exposure to German fire, and even minor penetrations often resulted in catastrophic fires that left crews no chance to escape. Churchill units, by contrast, thrived in these exact conditions. Their broad tracks distributed weight more effectively, allowing them to traverse flooded fields and marshy terrain without becoming mired. Urban centers, which typically slowed Sherman advances to a crawl, were the ideal environment for Churchills. In cities like Nijmegen, their low profile and thick armor allowed them to methodically clear fortified buildings and suppress enemy positions. Reports from the time describe Churchills advancing through streets with multiple hits absorbed, their crews calmly returning fire while accompanying infantry pushed forward. Bridges were crossed under fire using modified Churchill AVREs equipped with fascine bundles or bridging gear, a capability that Shermans could not match without extensive engineering support. The Rhine crossing in March 1945 offered a particularly dramatic illustration.
Sherman regiments were tasked with supporting rapid assaults and consolidating bridgeheads. The tanks moved in formations across the riverbanks, often exposed to artillery fire and counterattacks. While some units succeeded, the limited armor of the Sherman meant that any concentrated German defensive fire could disrupt operations almost immediately. Casualty rates among Sherman crews were high, and replacements were often needed before objectives could be secured. In contrast, Churchill units, particularly those modified as AVREs or crocodiles with flamethrowers, led the assault across the river. Their armor allowed them to suppress enemy positions directly, the low-profile turrets reducing vulnerability, and specialized engineering equipment enabled them to neutralize obstacles in real time. Infantry units advancing behind Churchills experienced far lower casualties than those accompanying Shermans in similar assaults, illustrating once again that survivability and mission completion were baked into British tank doctrine, rather than left to chance. Gun effectiveness continued to shape battlefield outcomes. Shermans, even when upgraded to Firefly variants with the 17-pounder gun, required careful positioning to exploit weak spots in German armor. Flanking maneuvers were often necessary to achieve penetration against Panthers and Tigers. Churchills, particularly later models with 75mm or specialized high-velocity guns, could engage medium and even heavy German armor more reliably, maintaining accurate fire while under direct assault. During the Battle of the Hochwald Forest, for instance, Churchill crews reported engaging multiple Panther tanks while sustaining hits from high-velocity rounds, emerging with minor damage that did not prevent mission completion. Sherman crews in the same engagement faced far higher casualties and mechanical losses, even when operating in larger numbers. The engineering adaptability of the Churchill extended beyond battlefield assault. In the Ardennes, during the winter of 1944-45, Churchill crocodiles provided a psychological and tactical edge in clearing heavily defended German villages. Their flamethrowers could suppress bunkers, fortifications, and enemy infantry without relying on extensive artillery barrages. Sherman variants could be fitted with similar devices, but their lighter frames and less resilient armor limited operational effectiveness. The risk to crews often outweighed tactical benefit. The British focus on purpose-built adaptations reinforced a doctrine where armor was integrated into every aspect of battlefield problem-solving, not merely as a mobile gun platform. Mechanical endurance under extreme conditions was another decisive factor. Winter operations in the Rhineland, combined with flooded and frozen terrain, imposed severe strain on all vehicles. Shermans, with relatively light suspension and gasoline engines, frequently experienced track failures, engine stalls, and immobilizations in deep mud or snow. Each immobilized tank required extraction, diverting manpower and exposing other units to fire. Churchills, with their reinforced suspension, wider tracks, and low-pressure engines, maintained operational continuity. Units could cross difficult terrain, engage enemy positions, and support infantry without the constant risk of being sidelined by environmental factors. This reliability under adverse conditions reinforced their strategic value, allowing British commanders to plan prolonged assaults with confidence in armored support. Crew survivability remained central. Sherman's tendency to ignite when penetrated remained a persistent issue. Reports from Germany in early 1945 describe scenarios in which Shermans hit by Panzerfausts or 75mm rounds resulted in near-instantaneous fire and crew casualties, forcing infantry to recover bodies under fire or abandon objectives temporarily. Churchills, in contrast, were frequently hit multiple times by comparable weapons, yet remained operational, and crews could often continue fighting or evacuate safely. This difference had profound tactical implications. Where Sherman crews hesitated or suffered high casualties, Churchill crews maintained momentum, directly influencing the success of operations. Psychological impact extended to both Allied infantry and enemy defenders. Allied infantry reported increased morale when advancing with Churchills in front, knowing that enemy fire could be absorbed and objectives were achievable. Conversely, Sherman formations advancing into fortified positions often experienced hesitation and elevated stress levels, slowing assaults and exposing units to ambush. German defenders, observing the ability of Churchills to advance under concentrated fire, sometimes chose to withdraw or avoid engagement, whereas Sherman advances were more likely to provoke desperate counterattacks. By the time Allied forces reached the industrial heartlands of Germany in early 1945, the operational lessons were clear. Sherman tanks excelled in speed, exploitation, and open-field maneuver, but vulnerabilities in armor and firepower required careful planning, flanking, and massed support to achieve objectives without unsustainable losses. Churchills excelled in assaulting fortified positions, urban combat, extreme terrain, and high-risk operations where durability, crew survivability, and engineering versatility were paramount.
The contrast was so pronounced that combined operations often relied on sequential deployment. Churchills would breach and secure difficult objectives, followed by Sherman units exploiting breakthroughs in open terrain. Logistics continued to reflect doctrinal differences. Shermans, abundant and easily repaired, were expected to be lost and replaced. Attrition was an operational reality. Churchills, fewer in number and costly to produce, were preserved and maintained meticulously, often being rebuilt or modified in the field to extend their operational life. Commanders planned operations around the sustained presence of Churchills rather than their replacement, reflecting a fundamentally different understanding of armored warfare. As the war drew closer to Germany's core, terrain and defenses became increasingly complex, and the distinctions between Sherman and Churchill performance became even more consequential. River crossings, fortified towns, dense forests, and minefields exposed Sherman's limitations while simultaneously highlighting Churchill advantages. Firepower, armor, engineering adaptability, mechanical reliability, and crew survivability all converged to make Churchills the preferred choice for high-risk, high-value objectives. American doctrine continued to leverage Shermans for speed and numerical superiority, but the operational record demonstrated that in critical, fortified, or complex environments, the Churchills' design philosophy delivered tangible, repeated advantages. The evolution of these engagements, from hedgerows in Normandy, through riverine and urban obstacles in the Netherlands, to the Rhine crossings and final push into Germany, illustrates a consistent pattern. American armor doctrine prized mobility and quantity, tolerating losses as part of operational design. British doctrine prioritized mission completion, crew endurance, and vehicle resilience, designing tanks to survive, adapt, and achieve objectives under conditions that would cripple Sherman formations. In high-intensity combat scenarios, particularly those involving fortified positions, urban combat, or adverse terrain, this distinction dictated outcomes. The Churchill was not merely a tank. It was an embodiment of a strategic philosophy, one that valued survivability and operational effectiveness over speed and replaceability. The operational consequences of this philosophical divergence shaped the final stages of the European theater, underscoring that armored warfare is as much about design doctrine and crew protection as it is about gun caliber or engine horsepower. As Allied forces pressed deeper into Germany during the spring of 1945, the contrast between Sherman and Churchill operations reached its most dramatic and consequential phase. The heartland presented a nightmare of obstacles for any armored force. Ruined cities littered with rubble, collapsed bridges over swollen rivers, dense forests transformed into defensive mazes, and fortified industrial complexes that had been prepared for years to repel attacks. Every tank, every crew, and every operational decision was tested to its limits. Sherman regiments, operating under American doctrine, continued to exploit mobility and massed formations whenever terrain allowed. Open highways through the Ruhr Valley permitted rapid advances, and Shermans could respond to fluid German retreats or counterattacks with impressive speed. American commanders relied heavily on numerical superiority. Dozens of Shermans moving together could saturate enemy defenses with firepower, forcing German armor and infantry to withdraw or face encirclement. However, even these advantageous situations often highlighted the inherent vulnerabilities of the design. Narrow streets, debris-laden intersections, and partially destroyed bridges slowed their advance, forcing Shermans into choke points where their thinner armor and higher profile became liabilities. Encounters with Panzerfaust teams in basements or hidden within factory complexes frequently resulted in catastrophic losses. In several documented cases, Shermans advancing along open streets would be suddenly disabled by single, well-placed shots, and because American doctrine assumed losses were tolerable, follow-up units had to rush in to continue the advance, often compounding casualties. Churchills, on the other hand, were deliberately employed in the most hazardous operations where survival was not optional. Cities like Duisburg, Essen, and later Hamburg required tanks capable of sustained engagement under concentrated enemy fire while supporting infantry in house-to-house combat. A single Churchill could absorb repeated hits from 75mm guns, Panzerfausts, and even captured 88mm artillery, allowing its crew to continue fighting and coordinating with engineers and infantry. The low silhouette of the turret reduced exposure, while thick armor allowed crews to survive direct hits that would have instantly destroyed Shermans. Battlefield reports consistently note that infantry morale increased dramatically when Churchills led assaults into heavily defended streets and factory complexes. Soldiers knew they had a moving shield and a reliable source of suppressive fire, reducing hesitation and casualties. Engineering adaptations reached a peak during these final operations. Churchill AVREs, equipped with petard mortars, could demolish fortified walls and bunkers with a single hit, clearing paths for infantry that Shermans could not breach.
Crocodile flame tanks provided psychological as well as tactical advantages, neutralizing defensive positions without the need for prolonged artillery bombardments. Mine-clearing variants ensured that heavily defended roads could be traversed without catastrophic losses. Shermans, while capable of mounting some modifications, were generally unable to replicate this range of purpose-built adaptations. Additional armor or field modifications often compromised mechanical reliability or maneuverability. British doctrine had intentionally designed these tanks as flexible platforms for problem-solving on the battlefield, while American doctrine prioritized generalist, replaceable mobility over specialization. The operational consequences of these differences were striking during the crossing of the Elbe River in late April 1945. Sherman regiments moved quickly along the riverbanks, but flooded fields, demolished bridges, and German artillery forced frequent halts. Mechanical failures became more common as the tanks struggled with muddy conditions and shell-cratered roads. Infantry accompanying the Shermans often had to wait under fire while disabled vehicles were recovered or bypassed. Churchills, however, led specialized assault units across the same rivers. AVREs constructed temporary crossings, Crocodiles suppressed fortified positions, and standard Churchill Mark VII tanks absorbed repeated enemy fire while maintaining firepower. One report details a single Churchill squadron neutralizing a factory complex defended by Panther and Tiger tanks while sustaining hits that would have destroyed multiple Shermans, allowing infantry to secure the area with minimal casualties. Gun performance remained a pivotal factor. Shermans with the standard 75mm gun were frequently outgunned by remaining German heavy armor, requiring tactical maneuvering and numerical support to achieve penetration. Firefly variants addressed this to some extent, but flanking shots were still necessary in many engagements. Churchills, particularly with 75mm guns in later marks or high-velocity 6-pounder variants, could engage medium and heavy German tanks directly, often from frontal positions, while maintaining protection. This allowed British tank commanders to plan direct assaults against fortified enemy armor without depending entirely on terrain or numerical advantage, a critical capability as German forces became increasingly concentrated in urban and industrial strongpoints. Mechanical endurance under extreme winter-spring conditions further emphasized Churchill advantages. Shermans, with lighter suspension and gasoline engines, were prone to track damage, engine stalls, and immobilization in snow, mud, and debris-strewn streets. Each failure required extraction under fire, diverting manpower and delaying operations. Churchills, with reinforced suspension, wide tracks, and low-pressure engines, maintained continuous operational capacity, enabling prolonged engagements and sustained infantry support. Commanders often deliberately assigned Churchills to the most challenging tasks, trusting their reliability and survivability to complete objectives where Shermans would likely be sidelined. Crew survivability remained central to the strategic calculus. Reports from late April and early May 1945 describe situations in which Shermans were destroyed instantly by Panzerfausts, 75mm rounds, or debris-induced ammunition cook-offs, leaving crews with little chance to escape. Churchills, even when struck multiple times by comparable weapons, often remained operational, allowing crews to fight on or evacuate safely. This not only preserved combat effectiveness, but also influenced tactical behavior. Churchill crews advanced with confidence under fire, while Sherman crews, aware of their vulnerability, often hesitated or relied heavily on numbers and maneuver. The psychological effect on German defenders was equally pronounced. Observing Churchills advancing methodically under concentrated fire had a demoralizing effect, with many defenders choosing withdrawal over engagement. Shermans, despite their numerical strength, often provoked determined counterattacks because their vulnerability was evident to defenders. The presence of Churchills in the vanguard created both a practical and psychological advantage that Sherman formations in isolation rarely achieved. By May 1945, as Allied forces converged on Berlin's periphery and final German resistance collapsed, the operational record was unambiguous. Shermans had demonstrated exceptional strategic mobility and the ability to exploit gaps in enemy defenses when terrain allowed. Yet their vulnerability to fortified positions, heavy armor, and constrained urban environments was consistently evident. Churchills, while slower and produced in fewer numbers, had repeatedly demonstrated their value in the highest-risk scenarios: urban combat, river crossings, minefields, and direct assaults on fortified positions. British doctrine, emphasizing mission completion, crew survivability, and specialized engineering adaptations, had been vindicated across multiple campaigns. The final months of the European theater underscored that armored warfare was not determined solely by engine power, gun caliber, or speed. Instead, operational philosophy, how designers, engineers, and commanders integrated protection, firepower, mobility, and adaptability, dictated battlefield outcomes. Shermans represented the Americans' embrace of mobility, mass, and replaceability, tolerating attrition as part of operational planning. Churchills represented the British emphasis on survivability, purpose-built engineering, and sustained combat capability under extreme conditions. When the two designs converged in combined operations, their strengths complemented one another, but in independent engagements, the operational differences could be decisive. As the last German defenses crumbled, it became clear that Churchill tanks had achieved what Shermans often could not. They survived concentrated fire, overcame fortified positions, and ensured the continuity of operations even in the most demanding terrain and conditions. Shermans had excelled in rapid exploitation, but the British design philosophy, embodied in the Churchill, demonstrated that armored warfare was as much about enduring the fight and completing the mission as it was about numbers, speed, or firepower. In the final analysis, the Churchill's legacy was not simply in victories won or territory gained, but in the validation of a doctrine that placed armor, crew survivability, and tactical reliability at the center of armored combat, a philosophy whose influence would endure in tank design for decades to come.